Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Today we have the IRRC Institute joining us to share investor views, and who better to represent the IRRC than Jon Lukomnik, who's the Executive Director of the Investor Responsibility Research Center Institute. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you, TK.
Now, the Institute is a nonprofit research organization that funds environmental, social, and corporate governance research. Their research reports empowers investors, policymakers, and other stakeholders to make better data-driven decisions. And we've certainly seen a lot of your projects, Jon. Now, interestingly, Jon is also the author and recently co-penned a book entitled What They Do With Your Money, How the Financial System Fails Us and How to Fix It. And as usual, Jon, you can get a copy of that on Amazon.
Can get anything on Amazon nowadays.
So the IRRC Institute has done some research projects recently, both on refreshment, important issue for us here on the show, and age diversity. Age diversity is especially sensitive since we just launched the Next Gen Board Leader. So just let's start by just giving a recap on those two projects that you guys took on and sort of what were the highlights.
Certainly, and thank you again for having me on the show. I think the most interesting thing is that the question of board refreshment has been taken up in the boardrooms as well as by investors, and we saw that in the last full year for which we have data, 2016. 9.5% of all board seats in the S&P 1500 were held by new directors. Directors have been appointed within the year. That is a large increase. Refreshment rates had been running at 5 or 6%. And interestingly, the composition of those new directors changed. So for instance, 24.4% of those new directors were female. Now, gender diversity has been a big issue, as you and your viewers know. And the gender diversity on boardrooms had been stuck at around 11, 12% as recently as 2008, partially because of this new wave of refreshment that's moved up. It's still sluggish, but it's at 17.8%, which is up, as I said, from about 11, 12%. The other thing that we found very interesting was tenure has marginally decreased because of that, from about 9 years to 8.7 years. But what we really thought was interesting was, what are the mechanisms that boards have to manage refreshment, right? And there are really three. There's board evaluations, there's age limits, and there's tenure limits. So the most common, about 40% of the boards have them, are age limits. 75 is the new 72, I guess. The limit seems to be moving up to 75. They're marginally effective at decreasing average age and tenure and increasing refreshment. Tenure limits actually are much more effective at reducing age and tenure, but only less than 5% of companies have them. What I did find fascinating in a negative sense was there are still 4% of companies which don't even do board evaluations, or at least they don't disclose board evaluations. And in fact, you do see a correlation where the average tenure across the S&P 1500 was about 8.7 years overall. The average tenure for those 4% of companies that don't do it was 11.6 years. Let me put that into context, because sometimes numbers are bloodless. We're about to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the iPhone. That means the average director on those boards was selected for a world before mobile shopping, geolocation, anything that involves basically the way most of America consumes today. And you have to ask yourself, if they haven't done an evaluation, and if those directors were appointed then, are they still the right directors for that board? So that's one reason why the issue of board refreshment is so important.
Well, we talk numerous times about the value of board evaluation ranking in the perfect world way over the other two that you mentioned, but we'll just have to see if that continues to improve. It's not so much the evaluation, it's whether they take action on the information that they get back.
I absolutely agree with you. The flip side of that is if you don't do the evaluation, you have no information. So for those 4% of companies that don't do evaluations, that's an easy first step.
Yeah. So why it's great to have you on the show is you've spent your career understanding boardrooms, investors' views, so you're the perfect person to ask this question to. And that is, what are the hot investor issues that boards should be sensitive to?
The way people normally would answer that question would be to give you a list. So here's the list. Clearly there's refreshment. I think the latest, greatest issue that people pay attention to are a couple of governance things like proxy access. If you are in a sector that's involved climate change on the social side, clearly for the last few years it's been capital allocation with the added emphasis of activism defense. But the list is really a manifestation of symptoms. And what I mean by that is if a board does what it's supposed to do and then communicates that actively, everything else falls into place. So what is a board really supposed to do? Number one, for this purpose, for dealing with investors, make sure we know that you're doing what you're supposed to. So tell us that you have a succession plan in place. The most important job is selecting the CEO. Tell us that you actually do that. Overseeing the company, having a strategic plan. Tell us that you have a strategic plan, how that's reviewed. That's not necessarily the proprietary information, but what's the process? Disclosing process goes a far way. Same thing, by the way, on the latest and greatest cybersecurity is always in that list. No one wants you to provide a roadmap to the bad guys in your disclosure, but tell us what the process is. Do you have a chief information security officer? Does the board review it? Who does it report to? How often? So it's have a strategic plan, know what the metrics of that strategic plan are over time, give some sense as much as you can to investors of where we should be judging, meaning over what time period. What should we be looking for? Is it new markets, new sales? Is it efficiencies? Disclose whatever metrics you can. Give us a time frame. And the rest of this really falls into place because, for instance, board refreshment, where we started, once you have a strategic plan, you can do your matrix and examine whether or not you have the right skills and experiences on the board. And if not, do a succession plan, and even if you have it, you should do a succession plan, but have a succession plan to get those experiences and skill sets. So that's what I mean by everything falls into place if the board's doing what you do anyway.
So when we did our investor board performance reviews earlier this year and last year, it was interesting to me because there was plenty of topics that the investors could say was their most important issue. And just to echo what you just said, the consensus was that the most important issue for boards was board composition. If you get the right people in the room that can do the right things, you end up with good results.
Right. I would add one other aspect, not so much for running the company, but for dealing with investors: disclose. I've had the privilege of having confidential information on a number of boards that really do a great job, but if you read the materials they give to investors, you wouldn't know how much time and effort and thought goes into some of those board meetings. Sometimes we over-lawyer things and people think of the Ks and the Qs and the proxies as compliance communications. They're not. They're opportunities to communicate to the investors what the strategic plan for your company is and how well you're executing.
Well, John, it's always a pleasure to have you come on. And again, you spent your career analyzing governance and investors, so it's always positive for our viewers when you have the chance to visit.
Thank you. It also helps when you've invested about $100 billion
Yeah.
over your lifetime. You actually care about these things a lot.
Yes. Well, thanks for joining us. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.